Welcome to Puzzle Proof. Join us as we unravel today's captivating story and solve exciting puzzles together. Get ready to engage your mind. Let the journey start. Miss Marple and Whispers in the Dark. Chapter 1. A quiet village disturbed. It was an ordinary morning in St. Mary Mead, a day like any other. The thatched cottages stood neatly in a row, their gardens in perfect bloom, the hedgerows freshly trimmed. Mrs. Weatherby's tabby cat stretched lazily on a sun-warmed wall, and the milkman made his rounds, tipping his cap to passers-by. But peace is a fragile thing, and in a village such as this, where time seemed to move gently, scandal had the force of an earthquake. The news spread swiftly, carried in hushed whispers from shop to shop, from Mrs. Phelps in the grocer's to Colonel Bantry at the post office. Eleanor Hastings was dead, and not just dead, murdered. At precisely 7:30, the dreadful discovery was made by Charlotte Hastings, her stepmother, who had gone to wake her for breakfast. A scream had shattered the quiet of Hastings Manor, a sound so piercing that old Mr. Dobbs, the gardener, later remarked that it had curdled the very marrow of his bones. Miss Marple, seated in her little cottage with her knitting, heard of the tragedy not an hour later. Mrs. Hartnell, breathless from exertion, delivered the details in great agitation. "Terrible thing, Miss Marple." "Dreadful. The poor girl, just lying there, strangled. And they say it wasn't just that. Something much worse." Mrs. Hartnell's voice dropped to a scandalized whisper. Miss Marple said nothing at first, only nodding gravely. Her keen blue eyes flickered with something not quite readable, interest, perhaps, or suspicion. "Such a tragic affair," she said at last, her fingers resuming their knitting with deliberate ease. "So young was she not? Barely out of girlhood, and no forced entry, you say?" "None," Mrs. Hartnell exclaimed, adjusting her hat. "The police say she must have known the killer. And her poor stepmother, can you imagine? Finding her own stepdaughter like that." Miss Marple could imagine it very well. She had seen the messy tangle of human emotions more times than most. Fear, greed, hatred, all were motives that lay beneath the surface of even the most respectable households. "Dear me," she said mildly. "How very sad, and what does poor Sir Alfred say?" "Locked himself in his study, they say," Mrs. Hartnell declared. "Won't speak to anyone. Grief, no doubt, though if you ask me, he's always been a hard man, Miss Marple." "Grief affects people in many ways," Miss Marple murmured, watching a sparrow flit to and fro on the garden path. "And what of the young man, Mr. Morton? They were to be engaged, were they not?" Mrs. Hartnell sniffed. "Engaged, indeed! Though I dare say there was some trouble there. The girl had a will of her own, I heard. If you ask me, there's more to this than meets the eye." Miss Marple did not need to be told that. She had already deduced as much. The official police inquiry began in earnest that afternoon. Inspector Craddock, a sensible man with a neat moustache, arrived from Scotland Yard, casting a weary glance at the assembled crowd gathered beyond the hedges of Hastings Manor. The body had already been examined by the local doctor, and the details, grim as they were, left little doubt about the nature of the crime. Eleanor had been strangled in her own bed. The bruising around her neck was unmistakable. The marks on her wrist suggested a struggle, and, most disturbingly, she had been violated before death. There was no sign of a break-in, no shattered glass, no tampered locks. Everything in her room was untouched, save for the chaos upon the bed, a crime of passion, or something more sinister. Charlotte Hastings, still trembling, recounted the moment of discovery. "I went to wake her. I knocked, of course, but there was no answer. I thought she had overslept, but when I went in, She shuddered, her hands twisting in her lap. She was just lying there. Her face was so pale, and her nightdress She broke off, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips. Inspector Craddock waited patiently, then spoke gently. "Did Eleanor have any visitors last night?" Charlotte blinked, as if startled by the question. No, I don't believe so. She was home all evening, I think. We dined together, just the two of us. Afterward, she went to her room. I went to bed soon after. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no noises in the night. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke. Her voice was mild, but her words carried weight. "It is very strange, don't you think, Mrs. Hastings? A young woman such as Eleanor, so full of life, and yet you say she was home all evening. Not out, not even a visitor." Charlotte frowned. "Not that I know of." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Because, you see, young people these days, they have such complicated lives, don't they? So many friendships, entanglements, loyalties that run deeper than they appear." The inspector turned to Miss Marple, sensing that the old lady's words were not idle musings, but something far sharper. "You think she was hiding something, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly. "Oh, my dear inspector," she said lightly. "I know she was." And in that moment, a shiver passed through the room, not from the cold, but from something else, something far darker. Chapter 2. 5 Suspects and 5 Secrets. The village of St. Mary Mead was abuzz with speculation. The shocking death of Eleanor Hastings had stirred up more than mere whispers. It had ignited a simmering undercurrent of unease, like a storm waiting to break over Hastings Manor. The arrival of Inspector Dermot Craddock from Scotland Yard had only intensified the tension. He was a practical man, not easily swayed by village gossip, but even he could not ignore the peculiar atmosphere surrounding the case. The suspects were all too close: family, fiancé, confidant, and of course, among the concerned faces at the edge of the scene was Miss Jane Marple, her eyes twinkling with that peculiar sharpness she reserved for cases that defied simple explanation. Sir Alfred Hastings, the unforgiving patriarch, seated in the study, Sir Alfred Hastings looked every bit the part of an embittered aristocrat. Tall, imposing, his silver hair neatly combed, yet his eyes held no sign of grief. If anything, they were guarded. Craddock cleared his throat. "Sir Alfred, can you tell me where you were on the night of your daughter's murder?" Sir Alfred's lips barely moved. "I retired early, 11 o'clock. My man Wilson can confirm that." "Did you hear anything?" "Nothing." His clipped answers did little to satisfy Craddock. Miss Marple, however, watched him carefully. His fingers, long and bony, tapped a slow rhythm against the arm of his chair. It was not the tapping of impatience, but of calculated restraint. "You did not approve of Eleanor's independence, I believe?" she said mildly. Sir Alfred's expression stiffened. "My daughter had modern ideas, foolish, headstrong ideas." "And did you ever voice this disapproval, sir?" He gave Miss Marple a long, considering look. "I am not a man who tolerates foolishness, Miss Marple." A curious choice of words. Not grief, not loss, foolishness. Charlotte Hastings, the unloved stepmother. Charlotte Hastings, in contrast, was a woman on the edge of composure. She sat in the parlour, her gloved hands folded tightly on her lap, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. I don't know what you mean by questioning me," she said nervously. "I found Eleanor. I was the one who screamed." "Yes, madam," Craddock said, "and you were the last person to see her before she retired for the night. Did she say anything unusual?" Charlotte hesitated, her fingers tightening over the embroidery on her skirt. She was quiet, distracted. I thought she might be upset about something. I asked, but she said it was nothing. Miss Marple smiled gently. She reminded you of her mother, didn't she, Mrs. Hastings? Charlotte flinched. She had the same look about her, the same stubbornness. Stubbornness, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. And did that trouble you? Charlotte's mouth pressed into a thin line. She did not answer. Henry Morton, the faithless fiancé. Henry Morton arrived at the manor looking pale and unsettled. His normally slicked-back hair was dishevelled, and there was an uncharacteristic tremor in his hands. "I loved Eleanor," he insisted. "You must believe that." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "And yet, Mr. Morton, there are those in the village who say you were seen with another woman only last week." Henry visibly paled. "That's a lie." Miss Marple, however, had been watching his hands, the slight twitch at the mention of the rumour, the defensive set of his jaw. "Do you know who Eleanor was meeting on the day before she died?" she asked softly. His lips parted as though to respond, then closed just as quickly. "I don't know what you mean," he muttered. A lie, of course. James Hastings, the reckless brother. James Hastings was the least convincing of all. He entered with an air of casual indifference, but there was something distinctly uneasy about his manner. "You were close to your sister?" Craddock asked. James scoffed. "As close as siblings can be." "You were in debt, weren't you?" James's easy smirk faltered. "I don't see what that has to do with anything." "Oh, but I do," Miss Marple said, watching him over her knitting. "Debts can be quite pressing, you know. They make people desperate, rash, even dangerous." James's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, the confidant. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, the last to be questioned, radiated calm. Too much calm. "Eleanor came to you for advice, didn't she?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," Blackwood admitted smoothly. She was troubled. She feared someone was watching her. "And did she say who?" Craddock pressed. Blackwood exhaled. She wasn't specific, but she was frightened. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. "Doctor, Blackwood, tell me, what did Eleanor know that she shouldn't have?" The doctor hesitated for only the briefest second. "I have no idea what you mean," he said at last. But Miss Marple already knew he was lying. As the interviews concluded, Miss Marple sat in her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly but purposefully. 5 suspects, 5 secrets. Sir Alfred, the cold patriarch, who feared disgrace more than grief. Charlotte, the resentful stepmother, haunted by a past rivalry. Henry, the faithless fiancé, entangled in an affair. James, the reckless brother, drowning in debt. Dr. Blackwood, the trusted friend, withholding the most dangerous secret of all. Oh yes, someone in Hastings Manor was guilty. Miss Marple took a sip of tea, watching the fire flicker in the grate. She only had to wait. Because murderers, in the end, always revealed themselves. Chapter 3. The Last Hours of Eleanor Hastings. The morning mist still clung to the village lanes as Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that settles before a storm. The villagers had fallen into uneasy murmurs, their gossip hushed whenever a constable passed. The brutal death of Eleanor Hastings had cast a long shadow over St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the smallest details, sensed that the key to the mystery lay in the young woman's final days. At the vicarage, the Reverend Leonard Clement, a dignified man in his late 50s, welcomed her into his study. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, offering her a seat by the fire. "I assume this visit concerns poor Eleanor?" Miss Marple nodded, her fingers lightly adjusting her knitting. "I understand she sought counsel with you shortly before she died, Mr. Clement. May I ask the nature of her visit?" The vicar frowned, tapping his fingers against the arm of his chair. She was troubled, quite unlike herself, nervous, even afraid. I asked if she wished to confide in me, but she hesitated. She said only that she had discovered something about her family, something that had unsettled her deeply. I encouraged her to unburden herself, but she merely said she would write it all down and get back to me. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-click. A letter? Indeed, the vicar confirmed. But I never received one. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes flickered. A letter had been written, but where was it now? That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Alice Barton, Eleanor's closest friend. The young woman was pale and drawn, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl as she spoke. "Eleanor was frightened, Miss Marple," Alice whispered. "I don't know what she found out, but it changed her. She wasn't sleeping. She told me she felt watched." "Watched," Miss Marple repeated gently. Alice nodded. "She said someone was always just out of sight, always near. I told her she was imagining things, but now—" She swallowed, her voice trembling. "Now I wonder if she was right." Miss Marple poured Alice another cup of tea, her expression unreadable. "And this secret she hinted at, she never told you what it was?" Alice shook her head. "Only that it had something to do with her mother. Something that was never meant to come to light." Miss Marple sat back, her mind working through the pieces. A secret concerning Eleanor's mother, a missing letter, the feeling of being watched. A puzzle was beginning to take shape, a dark, twisted puzzle hidden beneath the veneer of an aristocratic family's respectability. Miss Marple set down her cup with a decisive little click. "People often think murder is about hatred, my dear," she said quietly. "But more often than not, it's about fear." Chapter 4. Clues in the Shadows. The early autumn dusk in St. Mary Mead draped the village in a soft, diffused light, as if nature itself were holding its breath. At Hastings Manor, the sombre atmosphere was palpable. The recent tragedy of Eleanor Hastings's untimely death had left an indelible mark upon every stone and shrub of the venerable estate. It was in this unsettling calm that new, perplexing clues began to surface. Late that afternoon, while wandering through the meticulously kept gardens, a local gardener discovered a small piece of fabric caught on the ironwork of the garden gate. The cloth, torn and frayed at the edges, bore the unmistakable sheen of a fine material, perhaps a remnant from an expensive coat. The gardener, a wiry man with a keen eye for detail, reported his finding to Inspector Craddock, who in turn informed Miss Marple. With her characteristic calm, Miss Marple examined the fragment, holding it delicately between her fingers. "It appears, dear," she murmured thoughtfully, "that this piece may belong to someone of considerable means." Her eyes twinkled with a secret knowledge that belied her gentle demeanour. "Yet it is oddly out of place here, so near the gate. I wonder if our culprit was in a hurry to depart." Returning to the manor, Miss Marple visited Eleanor's room, a modest, elegantly furnished chamber that now seemed to whisper of lost hopes and concealed truths. A faint scent of an expensive cologne lingered in the air, subtle but persistent, as if clinging to the curtains or the edge of the dressing table. No one in the household claimed to wear such a fragrance, and the mystery of its origin deepened the intrigue. Later that evening, as twilight surrendered to the gathering darkness, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Mrs. Hudson, the long-serving family maid. In a hushed tone, the elderly servant confided, "Miss, I couldn't help but overhear a quarrel last night. I was tidying the study when voices raised in anger. It sounded like Miss Eleanor arguing with someone. I'd never heard her so upset before." The maid's eyes, wide with a mix of fear and pity, darted about as though the very shadows might conceal a lurking presence. It was dreadful, Miss Marple. I believe the voices belonged to Eleanor and one of the family members, but I couldn't make out who it was exactly. The conflicting testimonies, the torn fabric and the elusive scent all conspired to paint a picture of calculated secrecy. In the quiet solitude of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting needles clicking methodically. A neighbour's distant laughter outside the window contrasted sharply with the dark mood within, reminding her that beneath the veneer of village cheer lay layers of human complexity and hidden strife. Her mind turned to a crucial piece of information. Eleanor had been seen in secret company in the days before her death. A discreet comment from a local shopkeeper recalled, "I do remember young Eleanor whispering to a rather distinguished-looking gentleman at the market square last week. They exchanged something like hurried words, and she looked terribly nervous." This revelation added another dimension to the mystery, a clandestine meeting that might have provided both motive and opportunity. As the night deepened, Miss Marple reflected on the clues with a mixture of concern and intrigue. Each element, from the fabric on the gate to the lingering cologne and the overheard argument, served as a small thread in a tangled web of deceit. The tensions among the suspects, already rife from previous interrogations, now took on a new urgency. Had one of them attempted to conceal their involvement by leaving behind this subtle, incriminating mark? In her soft, measured voice, Miss Marple remarked to herself, "In the shadows of human behavior, the smallest detail may reveal the truth." Fear, as I always say, is often a more potent motivator than hatred. Thus, as the manor settled into an uneasy night, the stage was set for further revelations. The mystery was deepening, and every shadow seemed to whisper a secret yet to be told. Chapter 5. Red Herrings and Rising Tensions. The soft golden light of an autumn afternoon settled over St. Mary Mead, its gentle warmth contrasting starkly with the growing unease within the grand halls of Hastings Manor. Though outwardly serene, the estate pulsed with a silent tension. The police investigation had unearthed troubling questions, and within the walls of the old house, its inhabitants were beginning to fray under scrutiny. Miss Marple, ever unassuming in her neat cardigan and sensible shoes, sat with her knitting in the parlour, her needles moving rhythmically. But her keen blue eyes missed nothing. Sir Alfred Hastings and the burning letters. Sir Alfred had always been a man of discipline and propriety, but grief, if one could call it that, had made him more abrupt and secretive. That morning, Mrs. Hudson, the maid, had whispered something to Miss Marple in the hushed tones of a conspirator. "The master was burning papers in the study fireplace, miss," she said, wringing her hands. "A whole bundle of letters." Miss Marple raised a delicate eyebrow. "Letters, you say?" "I saw the edges of some," Mrs. Hudson continued. "Old ones they were, yellowed, like they'd been tucked away for years." Miss Marple thanked her kindly and pondered the information. Why would Sir Alfred suddenly destroy old letters unless they contained something he wished to remain hidden? The past, she had often observed, had a way of creeping into the present at the most inconvenient of times. Charlotte Hastings. A convenient sleep? Charlotte Hastings, Eleanor's stepmother, had provided no clear alibi for the night of the murder. When questioned, she had merely pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips and insisted, "I was asleep." A simple answer, perhaps too simple. Miss Marple, sitting beside her, gave a small, gentle smile. "A most restful night, then?" Charlotte hesitated. "Well, no. I suppose I did hear a noise, now that I think of it." "Oh?" "Footsteps, or something." Her fingers trembled slightly. "It was late." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her mind was sharp. Charlotte Hastings had no firm alibi, and she had every reason to resent Eleanor, who had always reminded Sir Alfred of his first wife. A woman spurred by jealousy was capable of many things. Henry Morton and the whispered affair. Henry Morton was less composed than usual. His confident air had slipped, and when the subject of his alleged affair was brought up, his answers became evasive. "I won't have my name dragged through the mud," he snapped when Craddock pressed him on the matter. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, simply murmured, "Truth has a funny way of surfacing, Mr. Morton." A flicker of something crossed his face. Guilt, anger, fear. James Hastings and the weight of debt. James Hastings, the elder brother, had been unusually quiet since the murder. It was no secret that his gambling debts had mounted to a dangerous level. Had Eleanor threatened to expose him? Miss Marple observed him keenly over tea that afternoon. Eleanor was rather protective of the family's reputation, wasn't she? James's teacup, he rattled slightly against the saucer. "What are you implying?" "Oh, nothing, dear," she said sweetly. "Only that when one is desperate, one can do the most regrettable things." His jaw tightened. "You're mistaken if you think I—" He stopped abruptly, realizing he had said too much. Miss Marple simply smiled. Another thread in an increasingly tangled web. Dr. Blackwood and the sedatives. The most peculiar detail of all was that Dr. Edmund Blackwood had prescribed Eleanor sedatives just days before she died. She was troubled, he explained when questioned. She wasn't sleeping well. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Oh dear, how unfortunate. What could have been weighing on her mind, I wonder?" Dr. Blackwood hesitated for the briefest moment. "She didn't say." Miss Marple took note. "A doctor, a close family friend, the last person to see Eleanor alive. Was he hiding something?" As the afternoon light dimmed, Miss Marple set down her knitting and took a sip of tea. Around her, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, though the final picture remained elusive. 5 suspects, 5 secrets. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried a weight of certainty. The past has a way of creeping into the present when one least expects it. And in this house, the past was knocking at the door, demanding to be heard. Chapter 6. The Second Crime. The early evening mist had begun to settle over St. Mary Mead, curling around the rooftops and winding through the narrow lanes like a whispering spectre. The village, already uneasy after the shocking murder of Eleanor Hastings, was about to be shaken once more. It was just past 7 o'clock when the news reached Miss Marple. The vicar's wife, breathless and wide-eyed, had come knocking at her cottage door. "Miss Marple, you won't believe it. There's been another attack. Henry Morton!" Miss Marple set down her knitting needles with a measured hand. "Oh dear, I rather thought something like this might happen." By the time Inspector Craddock arrived at Henry Morton's house, a modest but well-kept residence at the edge of the village, a small crowd had already gathered. Curious villagers stood outside in murmuring clusters, whispering to one another in hushed tones. Inside, Henry Morton lay slumped in a high-backed chair in his study, a gash on his forehead and a half-empty glass of brandy on the table beside him. His manservant, a middle-aged fellow named Carson, had found him unconscious and called for help at once. Craddock surveyed the scene grimly. "What happened here?" Carson's voice shook. I don't know, sir. I heard a thud from the study, came in and found Mr. Morton like this." He gestured helplessly. "There was no one else in the house, I swear it." Miss Marple, standing just behind the inspector, moved slowly into the room, her keen eyes taking in the surroundings with their usual sharpness. A chair had been overturned, the window was ajar, but there were no signs of forced entry. and then her eyes fell upon the desk. There, scrawled in bold, jagged letters, was a chilling message. "I know who you are." A cold silence fell upon the room. Inspector Craddock frowned. "Looks like someone wanted to frighten Morton. Maybe silence him?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Indeed. But there's something rather interesting about that handwriting." Craddock glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple leaned in, peering at the letters through her spectacles. "The writing? It's a remarkable imitation of Eleanor's." Craddock inhaled sharply. "Imitation? You think someone faked it?" "Oh, yes, dear," Miss Marple said softly. "You see, there is something deliberate about it. Someone wanted it to appear as though Eleanor wrote it before her death." A low groan broke the silence. Henry Morton stirred, his hand moving to his bandaged forehead. His eyes fluttered open, dazed at first, before widening with alarm. What happened?" he murmured. Craddock stepped forward. "That's what we'd like to know, Mr. Morton. Who did this to you?" Henry swallowed hard. His breath was ragged. I don't know. I was sitting here going over some letters. Then there was a shadow, a movement behind me. Next thing I knew, I was hit from behind." "Did you see the attacker?" Henry hesitated. "No, but I had the strangest feeling before it happened, as if I was being watched." Miss Marple spoke gently. "And what were you working on before the attack, Mr. Morton?" Henry's gaze darted toward the desk, the chilling message staring back at him. He flinched, his complexion paling. I don't know anything about that." Craddock folded his arms. "Are you sure? That looks like Eleanor's handwriting. What was it that she knew?" Henry hesitated once more, licking his lips. Then, shaking his head, he muttered, "I don't know." "I swear it." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him a moment longer, her expression unreadable. He was hiding something, that much was certain. That night, as the villagers buzzed with speculation and superstition, some whispering of ghosts, others of guilty consciences, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, deep in thought. The attack on Henry Morton was no coincidence. Someone had been afraid that Henry was getting too close to the truth, or perhaps afraid that he might confess what he already knew. She glanced once more at the words scrawled on the desk. A false message, a deception meant to unnerve. She picked up her knitting again, her fingers moving with steady precision. The past had been disturbed, and now it was striking back. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes slightly as she recalled Eleanor's missing letter, her fear in the days before her death. "Ah, yes," she murmured to herself. "The past is not quite done with us yet." And in the dark corners of Hastings Manor, secrets still waited to be unearthed. Chapter 7. Miss Marple Sees the Truth. A crisp autumn wind rattled the windows of Hastings Manor as Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles clicking with rhythmic precision. It was a quiet sound, almost hypnotic, but behind her calm exterior, her mind was working furiously. The case had been tangled, but now, finally, the threads were coming together. Miss Marple had been pondering Eleanor's missing letter for some time. The vicar had confirmed that Eleanor had written something before her death, a revelation of some kind, but it had never been delivered. Why? It was not destroyed in a moment of panic. No ashes had been found in the fireplace, no remnants in a wastepaper basket. That meant it had been stolen. Someone had taken great care to intercept it before it could be read. But who had the opportunity? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay within the very walls of Hastings Manor. The small fragment of fabric found caught on the garden gate had intrigued her from the start. It was of fine quality, the sort belonging to a tailored coat, or an expensive jacket. Inspector Craddock had examined the wardrobes of the household, but no one had reported a torn garment. That in itself was suspicious. A person who had torn their clothing would normally notice. Unless, of course, they couldn't admit it. Miss Marple had her suspicions, and now she needed to prove them. The lingering scent of expensive cologne had been present at two critical moments. First, in Eleanor's bedroom on the night of her murder, and second, in Henry Morton's study on the night of his attack. Miss Marple had taken note of the particular fragrance. It was deep and woody, a scent far too strong to be worn by a young woman like Eleanor. And then she recalled something small but significant. Dr. Edmund Blackwood had once absent-mindedly removed his gloves while speaking with her. The faintest trace of that very cologne had clung to the leather. It was all she needed to know. That evening, Miss Marple gathered the household in the drawing room, her expression as mild and pleasant as ever. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Sir Alfred, his face set in cold, aristocratic lines, stood stiffly near the mantel. Charlotte, her hands clasped tightly, looked away nervously. Henry Morton, still pale from his recent ordeal, avoided Miss Marple's gaze. James Hastings lounged in a chair, feigning disinterest, but his fingers drummed a steady beat on the armrest, a telltale sign of anxiety. And finally, Dr. Blackwood, standing apart from the rest, outwardly calm, but with an unmistakable tightness in his jaw. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began, her voice light, but with an edge of finality. "I have been thinking a great deal about Eleanor's murder, and it seems to me that the answer has been before us all along." She set down her knitting, folded her hands in her lap, and continued. "The missing letter was not destroyed. It was stolen. She let that settle. Eleanor knew something dangerous, and someone in this room made sure that knowledge never left her hands." She turned slightly, her keen eyes scanning the group. "The torn fabric found near the gate belonged to one of you. And then, of course, there is the cologne." She smiled ever so slightly. "It was present in Eleanor's room and later in Henry Morton's study when he was attacked." A hush fell over the room. No one moved. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "That, you see, is the most telling clue of all." Her gaze landed finally on Dr. Edmund Blackwood. "The truth, Doctor, is that Eleanor's death was not just a tragedy. It was a calculated act, and you, I believe, were at the very heart of it." Blackwood's face remained impassive, but his fingers, they clenched involuntarily. Miss Marple watched him closely. "Would you care to explain?" The room held its breath. The truth was out, and now all that remained was for the murderer to confess, or to fall apart, trying to deny it. Chapter 8. The Murderer Unmasked. The drawing room of Hastings Manor was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth. The assembled figures, Sir Alfred Hastings, Charlotte Hastings, Henry Morton, James Hastings, and Dr. Edmund Blackwood, sat or stood uneasily, their expressions ranging from anxious to defiant. In the centre of it all, in her usual modest but unshakable presence, sat Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles resting lightly in her lap. Her soft blue eyes, deceptively gentle, scanned each of them in turn. She had called them here for one reason, to unmask the murderer. She cleared her throat delicately and began. "My dear friends," she said, her voice mild but with an undeniable air of finality, "I have thought long and hard about this dreadful crime, and I believe I now know the truth." A flicker of tension passed through the room. "You see," she continued, "murderers always make the same mistake. They think themselves clever, and in many ways they are. They plan, they deceive, they cover their tracks. But what they never account for, what they cannot escape, is human nature itself. A faint smile touched her lips. And I have always found that human nature is far more revealing than any clue. Sir Alfred Hastings gave an impatient huff. This is all well and good, Miss Marple, but are we to hear the culprit's name, or will you keep us in suspense? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Sir Alfred, I shall tell you, but first, let us consider the evidence. She turned toward Henry Morton, who still looked pale from his recent attack. Mr. Morton, you were attacked in your own home, were you not? Henry nodded. Yes, struck from behind. His voice was tight. I never saw who it was. But before you lost consciousness, Miss Marple pressed, you sensed someone was there, didn't you? A scent, perhaps? Henry blinked. Yes, I remember now. Cologne, a strong one. Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward Dr. Edmund Blackwood. That very same cologne was present in Eleanor's room the night she was murdered. Dr. Blackwood, calm as ever, merely tilted his head. An interesting observation, Miss Marple, but hardly incriminating. Many gentlemen wear cologne. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Oh, yes, doctor, but not many gentlemen prescribe sedatives that turn up in their victim's bloodstream. A sharp intake of breath from Charlotte Hastings. You see, Miss Marple went on, Eleanor had been troubled in the days leading up to her death. She had spoken of a secret, a terrible discovery, and then she wrote a letter which, curiously, was never sent. Why? Because it was stolen. And where was it found? She turned to Inspector Craddock, who stepped forward, producing a folded, slightly crumpled sheet of paper. In Dr. Blackwood's study, he announced. All eyes turned to Blackwood. For the first time, a faint flicker of something crossed his expression, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The letter, Miss Marple continued, contained the truth Eleanor had uncovered, that you, Doctor Blackwood, were not just a family friend, but had once been involved with Eleanor's late mother. A stunned silence fell over the room. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Years ago, before her marriage to Sir Alfred, Eleanor's mother had an affair with you, Doctor Blackwood, a fact that had long been buried until Eleanor discovered it. Sir Alfred's face turned a ghastly shade of grey. That's impossible, he murmured. But Blackwood's silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but there was steel beneath it. You had everything to lose, Doctor. Eleanor's discovery meant that you had a possible, illegitimate claim to the Hastings family fortune. If this were made public, it could have caused a scandal, legal challenges, perhaps even an investigation into past affairs. Blackwood's lips curled into a thin, humourless smile. A compelling story, Miss Marple, he said lightly. But you have no proof. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, but I do. She gestured to Inspector Craddock, who produced a small glass vial. This, he said, was recovered from Dr. Blackwood's medical bag. It contained the same sedatives found in Eleanor's system. Miss Marple continued, You drugged Eleanor the night she died. It made it easier, didn't it, to silence her, to ensure she would never tell anyone what she had found out. Blackwood leaned back, crossing his legs with an air of nonchalance. And Henry? He asked coolly. Was I supposed to have attacked him as well? Miss Marple nodded. Oh yes, because you knew that Henry had been on the verge of telling the truth. He knew Eleanor had confided in him. You couldn't take the risk that he would say too much. Another silence, a charged, waiting silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Blackwood sighed and smiled. You know, he murmured, it's quite extraordinary, Miss Marple. You really do see everything. He rose, calm, composed, unrepentant. "I only did what was necessary." Inspector Craddock stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. "Dr. Blackwood, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Hastings and the attempted murder of Henry Morton." The tension in the room broke as Blackwood was led away. The weight of unspoken truths and long-buried secrets hung heavily in the air. Charlotte Hastings pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Sir Alfred sat in silence, staring at the fire. Henry Morton, his face drawn, muttered, "I should have spoken up sooner." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "The past cannot be undone, Mr. Morton." "But the truth, at least, is no longer hidden." Later, as the manor quieted and the village returned to its habitual order, Miss Marple sat in her own cosy parlour, a cup of tea in hand. As the fire flickered in the hearth, she mused aloud, "There is always a shadow in the past, but the light of truth never truly goes out." Then with a contented sigh she picked up her knitting once more